I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Well, hello and welcome back to another week of Contemplating Culture.
Hello, everyone.
I guess last week we were looking at the disenchantment of the physical natural world. So this week we're looking at what I would call maybe the disenchantment of society. So one of the other bulwarks, we were talking about the bulwarks, the things kind of holding faith in place, was that society was held in place and it was kind of ordered and structured. And so just as people looked at the natural world and thought, you know, there's got to be something, there's got to be God holding that in place, they did a similar thing with society, saying it's held in place, therefore God must be the one holding it in place. And so we're looking at kind of like a parallel movement that's happening with society as people start to say, actually, is that what's holding it in place? Is that even the way we want society to be? So there's two kind of movements that we're looking at today. The first of them is looking at, actually, is society held in place by God? So I've titled this week, When God is No Longer the Glue of Society. So Taylor talks about the period of time when society was very much an us. And we're talking about, obviously, in this conversation about the movement of Western society. So I'd say there's some cultures that are still an us society. But in the West, we're very much an I society. That's how we identify primarily. And then maybe it's an us as a group of I's rather than us being the predominant. And so the us was kind of held in place because you needed it to be there. And so anyone who had their own thoughts that conflicted with that were kind of like the public menace of the society. And the other kind of element with that was that this society was held in place by public rituals that called on the power of God. So maybe today it's possible to believe in God and believe in heaven, but not need the power of God in daily life. But we're talking about the period when you really needed the power of God in daily life to sustain the way that society was kind of held in place. And then the next thing Taylor talks about is kind of in this mix is he calls tensions in equilibrium. It was a society that was really held in tension. So you had, you know, like the clergy that were all about the transcendent, the afterlife, that whole realm of indulgences and all those kinds of things. But then you've also got the working people, the married life, and that's all about wellness here and now. So you've got these two things of like self-transcendence and human flourishing kind of in tension. And there's this kind of little phrase that Taylor uses, it might be from somewhere else, that kind of highlights what this society was. So he says, the clergy pray for all, the lords defend all, the peasants labour for all. Yes, all is well. And it's this sense that everyone has their place in this society, that I know who I am because I know what my job for society is. And all these kind of cogs, even though there's a tension, they're kind of held in place. And every now and then, society will offer me like a carnival kind of experience where we get to like throw off all the structure for a day and we have this little safety valve of the tension. But then we move into the period of what he calls the French revolutions, not the French Revolution, but the revolutions. These movements of actually what happens if we start to look at maybe not that structure, a different way of being. And Kat, you've definitely studied the French Revolution far more than I have, which is zero. So maybe you can share with us a little bit of what that kind of period was like in France.
Gracious, now you're taking me right back to high school. Well, I think we all know the story of the first part of the French Revolution. You've got the king, the queen, they live in the lap of luxury. There's that whole mythology about delegation that comes to the queen and says the peasants have no bread, and she kind of was, well, why don't they eat cake? Like a complete misunderstanding of what the state of the other is like, if you like. And this is the society that you have God kind of holding together, if you like, the society that for centuries now, we just assumed that God has chosen the king and anointed him. You have this whole coronation ritual in the cathedral with the the bishop crowning him. This whole idea that society works the way it works because this is how God made it to work. So when you're questioning society, when you're questioning the way the world works, you're not just questioning society, you're questioning God.
Right.
So you can understand then when you have this sudden overthrow, this rising up of the peasants, of the ordinary people, and overthrowing the regime, the king, all the nobles, they also throw out God.
Right.
Because God is what is holding this structure in place. And if you keep God, you keep the possibility of this structure that is holding you down.
Okay.
So this is the initial revolution, the Bastille, the prison where all the mentally ill prisoners are held, is stormed, and the king and queen are taken prisoner and ultimately beheaded. But I think definitely here in Australia, I don't know whether anywhere outside of France studies the French revolutions properly in school history. I think I've picked up more in my reading since than anything I picked up at school. But I definitely had always thought of the French Revolution as this one event in history where they rise up and suddenly there's this republic. Actually, there's a series of republics and a series of overthrows. And someone who knows French history really well is probably getting frustrated at my brushing over here. But basically, you're not safe even when you're sitting at the top. There's someone with new ideas, someone who doesn't trust you, like the power that was at the top that corrupts. And is it who said that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely? So the corruption of power is still present in the Republic. So you have leader after leader being assassinated or being denounced and being the next victim of the guillotine. This society is not stable at all. Hence then you get Napoleon, who comes and brings almost some stability again. The world looks like it's gonna hold together.
Okay.
But that doesn't last, because already the idea that you can have a society without God, the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity, these things have already overturned that familiar pattern. And I don't think France could ever go back to the way it was before. So a few attempts to bring back monarchy or something like it don't work anymore because already it's crumbled.
Yeah.
The anti-structure, if you like, that would come out for a day or two in Carnival has for a season taken over. And what arises out of the end of that is not the revival of what was. It couldn't be anymore. It's gone.
Yeah.
What rises out of that is a new structure, a new way of being where, as you say, I rather than we is what dominates people's thinking. Because if you think of that like world of anti-structure, in such a world where the next minute somebody might stab you in the back, the next minute somebody completely different might be in power, what you get is the only way to survive is to look out for me and for my people. So the people who did best out of the French revolutions, plural, you see changing sides every time. And the best example of that, if you know the musical of Les Mis, is the tavern owner. What's his name? Thénardier. And he's a good revolutionary. And then at the end of the musical where there's a new rising up of monarchy again, he's suddenly seen in a completely different guise. He's taken on a new personality where he's all for a different style of regime. And that is typical of this kind of unrest of I'm looking after myself and I don't care who's in power, but I'll find a way to fit in order to survive, in order to flourish.
Yeah, that's awesome. You were saying, like, as everyone knows, the beginnings of the French Revolution. I actually have no idea. I've never studied it. So that's all new stuff to me. And I guess what we're seeing there is that, like what you were saying, an instability that then can't kind of be taken away. And so even though none of these French revolutions held, it's created an instability in Europe then, because Europe's looking on and all of these ideas, whether or not they came through to a stable conclusion, are now starting to take grip in different ways. And so this is one of the things when we start questioning the structure of society. I guess I would call this kind of section.
And it's not just Europe. I'm surprised actually that Taylor didn't then draw he might have, I haven't read the book, remember, draw the links to the American revolutions and the way that this destabilizes essentially now the Western world and the rise of the United States.
Well, it's interesting. He's going to get to that. Yeah, because he's going to talk about in France, the revolutions kind of came to nothing in terms of a stable society. But then in America, the revolution did come to a stable society. So kind of what was the factors in each one that were important?
Well, let's let him kind of unpack that, as I'm sure we go through the book, we will. One thought that's coming to me is that, the French Revolution throws God out of the glue of society. And so this kind of idea of separation of church and state that is enshrined so deeply in the American state of being comes first in France and exists still in France today, this idea that the two shouldn't impinge upon one another. And we have it as part of our Western thinking a bit still, like even in a country that was colonized by the UK, there's this idea in our heads, I would say even in Australia today, or the separation of church and state.
Yeah, that's definitely a value that we should aspire to.
Yeah.
Is a commonly held value.
Absolutely. And yet, as missionaries, we would say the exact opposite when we're discipling somebody into faith. So we were talking about this morning the parable of the treasure in the field. The whole idea that once you find faith, once you find Jesus, he's worth everything. Mm-hmm. It's worth giving everything for. And that kind of goes back in the other direction of every part of my life then becomes permeated by my faith, that religion isn't something I can neatly compartmentalize into outside of my daily work or family life or other things. It's not neatly, I have my prayer time at that time of day and God can't escape. But actually, the faith that we're trying to impart to people is a faith that permeates everything, that to a certain extent that former society had right. They just didn't have it all right. And as a person of the 21st century, I can look at them and go, the issue wasn't God as a part of every part of society. The issue was thinking that God ordained society had to be a particular way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a challenge for us even today, that, how do you live faith? How do you hold on to a way of living that allows God to permeate every part of my life, but not ritualize it into having to be a particular way?
And we're seeing a huge increase, I think, in the people that are separating faith from religion. Those particular rituals or the particular way of doing faith that was religion. Now, I don't really need to have religion to have God. And even, I don't know, but it might have even started in that kind of, well, if I can't take my religion into the public sphere, then I'll just keep the faith part. Like, I'll keep my private faith and I don't even need to talk about that. Like, it might influence my decisions, but yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting thing we're experiencing.
Well, I think it's a step before that. It's coming out of that individualized society, so I can neatly package my own individual religion. I don't have to submit to a we believe that God is like this kind of reality. I think the tension we sit in is that both and. I don't know if I've spoken about this on the podcast before, but the person who pointed out to me that with God and faith, it's more often both and than either or, opened a whole world to me of, oh great, I don't have to choose. I don't have to choose between loving the church and having my own faith. I don't have to choose between understanding that as a society we are a we, but knowing that I am an I. Mm-hmm. I don't have to choose between God in my daily life and a private prayer time. Mm-hmm. Both and works really well for me. But we live in a society where maybe we've always lived in a world, maybe it's a human thing, that it's easier to deal with an either or, So, as you say, we've got a whole part of society who are into private faith and choose your own spirituality, and it doesn't impact on anyone else. It doesn't get ruled by anybody else, if you like. And then you've got a whole bunch of other people who are looking for a space that's completely the opposite to that, where I can live in the safety of this is how it is. So, people looking for ritual to hold their life together, people looking for a church to tell me how things should be and how things are because it's safer there, or the world was a simpler place in those times, and they're not exactly saying we should go back to it, but they're seeing the beauty and reaching out for it.
And again, it's probably a both and. We I think are called to embrace the security, the structure of ritual. Like, I think that's one of the gifts that God offers us is rest in the ritual, the rhythm, all of that kind of thing. But at the same time, we're meant to engage our personal being in that and have our personal relationship with God that finds expression as well as the ritual kind of thing. So if we're talking about this as a major tension that I think a lot of our young people, or just people in the church in general, but I think particularly young people are experiencing at the moment, is this pull. I don't know, like, what can we offer them in that space? How can we help them hold the tension?
Well, I think first of all, pointing out the tension there is a really good start. I think I understand the tension because I have felt the pull in both directions. I've felt the pull to choose. The glorious freedom for me was realizing that I could choose all, like Teresa of Lisieux, that God is bigger than our either or. That's gift, I think. Listening to me, my eye. Even it's bigger than just faith, I would say. It's like one of the things that really helps me see it is just living in an intercultural situation where somebody else that I live with culture has a whole different way of seeing the world, or a whole different approach to things that helps me stop and go, hang on a minute, there's more than one way of doing this.
Yeah.
And they're not wrong just because I'm right. Actually, we're both right, and how do I live in the tension of that?
Yeah. Of actually, I'm living with a worldview at the moment and being able to name it as that.
Yeah.
And it's one way. It's not the only way. Do you think the way our society is at the moment supports that?
Yes and no. I don't think it knows what it thinks. I think it rewards, or the people who survive, the people who get on best probably are the I people, but the people society celebrates are the we people.
Okay.
If you know what I mean. Like we all like to celebrate the heroes who save the world, who look out for the other, who see life in terms of we. But society's actually structured to reward people who look out for the I, looking after myself, changing skins to fit whatever works.
It's interesting.
In fact, I was listening to a podcast recently that was talking about virtue signaling as a way of doing that, a company that's big and getting ahead and is, if you like, looking out for itself, looking out for the I of those who are running it, kind of talking about supporting this movement or being ecologically friendly or whatever, in order to get that acclaim for the we. Never mind that it doesn't want to restructure economically in order that they're not using slave labor or whatever other things, paying people what they're worth, whatever other things you could complain about in them that it might make you not want to support them, but because they want the acclaim for we as well as the monetary reward of the I.
Yeah.
It's a different reality in faith, I think. I don't think you have to hold the two in tension, because what happens as we grow in relationship with God is I personally have a personal relationship with God who is love. And the closer I draw to God who is love, this is the theory anyway, I begin to share his heart. And his heart is love. And that therefore takes me out of myself to see the world in terms of we.
It's interesting because I think I still see a lot of people that aren't in that space, are sitting in the I and don't want to join the we.
I don't think in faith it's necessarily that conscious, but I think it's beautifully illustrated, say, by the life of Catherine of Siena, who, in her intense love for God, withdraws from the world and pretty much locks herself in her bedroom for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, God literally pushes her out into the streets, into the world. And she spends the rest of her life in this kind of frenetic activity where she hardly eats or sleeps. She pours herself out for the other.
And that's maybe it. Maybe you've hit on something there, that our faith is meant to take us to the other. That's the very heart of God, is for the other. That's the message of the Trinity, is it's for the other. There's others. There's always others. That the love is for and about. And yeah. And I guess just looking at the instability of society that has kind of been bequeathed to us from this era of reforming society, I guess one of the things that we want to do as missionaries is be highlighting for people that might be really searching or struggling in that space to find sources of stability in faith. So it might be in planting themselves in a community, planting themselves in really good, wholesome relationships, having, good direction or pastoral care or mentorship or something that reminds them that there's more than the I, something that is stable, that even if they're not okay, that everything doesn't sit on them, something to take all the pressure off them to remake and reform the world. And I guess ultimately to offer them God.
Absolutely. There's something amazing, isn't there, in the realization that we've got this great big God who actually looks after the world. Was it yesterday I was saying at lunch, there's a freedom in fallibility, in making mistakes and realizing that the worst that probably comes of it is that I'm humiliated and I let someone down, but the world goes on. That God carries the world, not me.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. I've definitely learnt a lot, and I think I probably have things to think about too. Yeah, so maybe as we go forward from this conversation, I would say 2 things. Take something of this into conversation and just see, what's kind of happening in you, but what's happening in other people. How do they kind of view this tension or this remaking of what is society and who am I for society, or what's society for me? Just these kind of questions. And then maybe just to spend some time looking at where the tension sits in your own life, where you're feeling pulled between things, and just allowing the both and to sit and to rest in that place. And maybe thirdly, just to find a freedom in saying yes to the we as well as the I. I think a lot of the pressure from our society is on the I. You don't really need to strive out to carve the I. So maybe just to spend some time looking at, who is the other that I'm called to? Who is the we that I need to kind of make some kind of commitment to being a part of? Yeah. So thank you. And until next time, be well.
See you later.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.